So I'm going to dive a little bit deeper into what we mean by APIs and what we've been doing behind the introduction that Stephen gave. So this is I'm not going to cover every single technical aspect by a long shot, but we're going to touch on a few areas which might be of interest to yourselves. So first of all, what type of API have we built here? So a few years ago, a group of big players in the marketplace and little players got together and decided a standard for what API should look like in the London market, and our API follows that specification exactly. And what that calls for is REST APIs. So you might have heard this. It's used a lot incorrectly, and to use it correctly means you need to do a number of things which are listed on the left-hand side. But fundamentally, this is reusing all of the techniques that HTTP and the web uses for scalability and global scale of connecting things together, and using those for APIs. So we use lots of HTTP things, and we use those properly. You might also know about the level 1, level 2, level 3 REST APIs, and we're doing a level 3 one. So this means that we pass content properly, we represent state, and we transfer it, which is where the acronym REST comes from. So there's a lot of detailed implementation here, which we have shared with PPL and the eBixer partners of how to implement this type of API and to speed them along. And we use that ourselves for the different parts of the SDK, which I will talk about in a minute. So that's the REST stuff. I certainly more than willing to talk about more detail, but that's as far as I'm going to go on that particular bit here today. On the content side, if you know about how PPL works, there's plenty of forms and things which you'll see just in a few minutes in the demos, where you enter dates and numbers and things like that, and that's structured content. There's also quite a lot of unstructured content in the large commercial contract placing world, because basically you're placing large Word documents, which are contracts, and you're having to pass them between people. And so that's what we call unstructured content. The computer doesn't understand it. And we directly support those in whatever their original format is. So it's a Word document or a PDF document, and pass those around. So the API encompasses both types of that data as REST APIs can naturally do. On the security side, which is a whole world of interest here, because we basically have to have a security system which is going to work across the market and enable people to provide software as a service applications to other organizations. So we split the authentication authorization according to the agreed API standard and the API gateway that's provided to the London market. So the first question is how does the system know who I am? And we use well-known and trusted systems which can verify and vouch for identities. An example which is widely used is Azure AD. We don't actually store any passwords or any system ever in the security. So that's the authentication. There's various options, but generally Azure AD is sort of the main place to go there, but you can use your own if you want to. On the authorization side, the API gateway, which sits in front of all calls to APIs in this world, has coarse-grained, which is, are you allowed to even call this API type level? And then the finer-grained, which is, am I allowed to update this submission on this particular quotation? That's left to the back-end system, which in this case would be PPL, and it would look at the role and who the user was and their role and their permissions and what they're trying to do and decide whether or not they're allowed to make the change. So that's how the security works. And then on notifications, so the next obvious question is, when you're building systems, how do you know that things are changed so you can go and pick up new things or modified things? And so we currently support one of the two ways you can do this. So that's the first is polling. And so every so often, which could be once a minute, once every 15 minutes, once a day, whatever the rate you want to do, you can basically go to the IPO and say, what has changed or been created? And the API will then give you a list, and you can suck those into your system. But obviously, you don't get to know anything above the rate that you're polling. So another accepted way of doing this is notifications, where basically when something changes that you might care about, that you get sent something and then you can then go off and get the details from the API. So currently we only support polling, and that's because the agreed API standard and the API gateway that we have only supports the polling, although the capability is there to do notifications, and it's something we're actively looking at the moment. And I think we have some way to go on that, but we have a good idea of how it's going to work. So those are common questions that people ask when we first talk about the API. So that's ones we've covered there. So now I'm going to dig a little bit deeper into how does this work. So this picture, as we're looking at it right now, shows PPL at the bottom, and it shows a broker on the left and a carrier on the right. And they communicate using whatever means they want to, even face-to-face. And they then type systems into whatever policy administration system their company organization provides to them. And then they will then take the Word documents they've outputted from those systems and upload them into the placement system via its user interface and enter a whole series of technical structured data through the UI and press the buttons, and eventually the underwriter will be able to see when they next poll, because effectively the underwriter polls, he goes to the placement system, has a look and goes, okay, so I can see there's a new submission for me. I look at it and I respond with perhaps another document or some data. And so that's how it works right now. And how is it going to change with the new API? So first thing is we have an API gateway in between in this world, which checks who you are and that you're allowed to, as an organization or an application, call the API. And so the first thing that one of these systems might do is actually trying to create resources, we call them. So records, objects, entities, whatever the name you might use, they're all the same thing. So in our world, submission is an obvious thing to talk about. An uploaded document, which is the second one along. So there are what we call collections of these resources in the system already, and we are representing those out through the API. And another thing you might then do is to update the already existing resources with some new state, and that then gets sent across and will be updated in PPL. And so then the third thing you could do is delete, and I'm not showing that here, but it doesn't happen so often in the PPL API, but there are things you can delete. And the fourth one would be query. So I want to display all of the submissions which were meant for me and haven't been actioned yet. So that's a query effectively, and the APIs allow you to do some level of querying. The most frequent and used is not SQL querying, but it's basically aimed at the level that would be useful for the application above. And as we can see here, so we'll make that request down, and the PPL system then works out what you needed to know, and those resources or the representations of those resources get passed up to the top. And so this is where we've now put a bit more detail along the bottom. So we have different types of resources. You can see submission documents, and those are collections of many of those things, because obviously nothing lives in isolation. And there are these links between them, which are exactly the same type of links that you would get between a web page and another web page. Everything here has a URI, a URL, just like a web page does. So that's a bit of detail of how the system works. First thing that's really important to understand is that no user ever calls an API. It's always an application of one type or another, and you'll see some of those in the demo in a few minutes. So the next sort of connection here between what Stephen was talking about and what this API does is, so Stephen spoke a lot about how we do the definition and how I put lots and lots of structured data into that model. And what we have done is written quite a lot of code and very clever stuff to turn that structured data into useful things for you. So examples we've got here are UML diagrams, and we generate the Swagger directly out of the model. We generate C# view and domain models, and we provide those as source code. We produce a huge amounts of the documentation, which Paul will show you next, and that comes directly from that structured data store. And as Stephen said, we also have a test harness. So this test harness is not an implementation of a placing platform. It's an implementation of the API and the behavior that API has. And what the test harness allows you to do is have something which will sensibly reply to the requests of the API and behave very much like a placing platform would, so that you can, one, test independently, but also test your system independently of the PPL system. So you can have your own local developer can run it on their own machine, or you could run it in your SIT environment, and you can then put the state you want. It will be under your control. Again, we provide the code for that in a Git repo, so you can build it and deploy it yourself and fill the state with whatever you need. And the adoption stuff, which follows on from that, Stephen's spoken a lot about that already. We can probably skip over that one. So we've talked about the SDK. So the SDK is many, many things. We have a list of like 27 different things that make up the SDK. These are some of the ones we're going to talk about today. So I just spoke about the test harness. So that's our implementation of the API, but not a real placing platform, which you can deploy in your environments for test purposes. And we have about 1,000 acceptance tests, which run against that test harness and also run against the PPL implementation. And that's how we check that both are in line. And if you wanted to, you could run those tests yourself. And similarly, we have a demo user interface, which is a UX, which you will see last in this set of demos. And that calls either the test harness or the real PPL implementation, and will show the state that it gets back from the API in a sensible way. Or you can do something a bit more close to the metal and use Postman to directly call the APIs, and you'll see the JSON unstructured data flying back and forth for that. And we also then have the developer portal, where we have created the structured data and turned it into content that we can view.